Okay, so you should now be able to see my screen. So in this webinar today, we're going to have two facilitators to go through the agenda. So my name is Liz. I use she, her pronouns, and I work with the Gastivists. And our second facilitator is going to be Kate. Kate, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, yeah, my name's Kate. I use she, her pronouns as well. I'm based in Edinburgh in Scotland, and I work at Friends of the Earth Scotland and have a bunch of online experience from being part of Youngfo Europe. It's cool to see some people here from Youngfo and like a bunch of other things like that. And I've been running a lot of kind of online meetings and webinars over the last couple of months, so can share what I've learned from that, I guess.
Great, thank you, Kate. So I'm gonna take us through the agenda quickly so you know what to expect in the next hour and a half or so. So that's on slide 2. If you can see either on the screen share or you have the link if you want to be able to go back and forth yourself. So what we're trying to get through today is to have a bit of an overview on facilitating online meetings. So we're going to touch on a bit like principles of or tips of facilitation in general and how these can be translated into online meetings as we're in this context where a lot of our organizing has had to, or most of our organizing has had to move online. And that's not necessarily something that we're all familiar with or comfortable with. So we're going to go through some tips and principles to help navigate those meetings online. We're going to start with a quick introduction where you'll get a chance to introduce yourself in an online way. And then we'll have a bit on what makes a good facilitator in general, not just online, but also having this aspect of how does this translate online. We will share some facilitating tools that can be useful in the meetings you might be helping to put together. And then we'll have a tiny bit of space towards the end for questions, and we'll share some resources. So first we wanted to share this as a potential tool when you're facilitating your meetings and also to get a sense of who's in the room today. So if you go on slide 3, on the presentation, you can introduce yourself on the presentation. So basically you take one of the squares on the right and you can write your name in it. So for example, if I put Liz, I can put my pronouns and the organization I'm from. And then you can just pull the chair around our virtual table. So I'll give you a couple minutes to do this. And then we'll move to the next point. That seems to be working quite smoothly for people, which is great.
Some people have even added fancy fonts. I like this style.
Yeah. Oh yeah, there's a lot of creativity around there. Really nice fonts, and everyone is clearly on it, which is great. Cool. That is. So it's nice to see who's around the table, and welcome to all of you. So this template is from Training for Change, and yeah, as I said, we wanted to introduce it like both to see who's in the room today, but also as like a tool and a template that can be quite useful if you're facilitating online meetings where people don't necessarily know each other, and to have a sense of who's in there. You can also get back to it and be like, oh, I wanted to check in with this person after the meeting about this thing that they said. You can go back to this and have a quick overview of who was around the table. So that can be quite useful. Great. So we are now going to move to the next agenda point, which Kate is going to talk us through on slide 4, which is a little bit of a Zoom explainer, as Zoom has been seems to be the main platform that people are using for online meetings. So we're gonna go through a little bit of how this works. So Kate, the floor is yours.
Thanks. Do you want to just present the presentation just so that the words are a bit bigger? It might be easier for people. Sorry.
I always get really confused because for some reason my my Google stuff is always in French and I don't know where to find anything.
Is that I'm not going to Leah? Like we're being recorded trying to speak French, like the bit where kind of present, right?
Oh yeah, got it. Okay.
Amazing. Cool. Yeah, so I'm going to just talk through a few things around Zoom and some of the tools that you can use, and then touch on security, which is obviously like a really big issue and important to try and make sure that these spaces are safe as possible. So yeah, okay, maybe I'll just run through some of these things, and then if there's any like other questions or like people want to add things, like probably not everything's going to be on here, we can do that afterwards. So there's a few like basic things that it's worth running through. So one of the first ones is, so if you're trying to schedule a meeting, obviously one of the issues that a lot of people have been having is kind of unwanted guests within those spaces who are there to disrupt or cause issues. So when scheduling a meeting, like the first most important principle is only share a link as far as you need to. So if it is a session for a private group, just share it with that private group. If it's a more public event, consider putting up a kind of sign up, like I think for this one, Gastivists made people sign up via Eventbrite or something, and then you get sent the link, and that does quite a lot in itself to prevent people finding the link on social media, for instance, and getting in. And then when you're sharing that link, you can put a password on it, and you can make it so that people who have the link, in the settings you can make it so people have the link don't need to enter the password, but it means that other people can't like guess the meeting ID and join kind of randomly, because they'll be after a password at that point. So there's a few things you can do to like put in some barriers in place to make sure that only people who are meant to be in the meeting are in the meeting. A couple of kind of quick fixes for tech issues. So quite often people will join and then have issues with speakers or microphones or hearing, etc. So like the basic thing to start with is you should see down at the bottom of your screens, or if you're on a kind of tablet, you might have to tap the screen, it'll come up a little microphone that says, it'll say unmute for you, and something that says either stop or start video, and next to those are some little up arrows, and if you click the up arrows, then it shows you which microphone, speaker and camera your computer has connected to, or Zoom has connected to. So yeah, one of the main issues that you see is that people have not got the right one selected. It's connected to, you know, like a speaker somewhere else, for instance. So that's like a really quick fix you can do for people, and you can, sometimes it's worth typing that in the chat if people can't hear, or sending that in advance. And then another like really simple quick tech issue is around sound. So sometimes people can't, it's not loud enough, or they're getting quite a lot of feedback. So muting, as Lee said, is like, again, one of the really easy things you can do, so make sure anyone who's not speaking is on mute, and also using headphones reduces that feedback. So it's not like you're saying something and then it's reverberating back in people's into people's microphones. And there's obviously a lot of other like tech issues that you can't necessarily deal with, like if it's someone's computer has the problem with connecting to the microphone, this won't deal with that. But these are some like quick things that you can try and do to help people that are joining the meeting. And also just like sending out, there's quite a lot of guides on how to join a Zoom meeting, which we can probably share some of those afterwards, which are quite useful to send to people who are joining for the first time. I've also, like, it might be worth, if you've got a group that isn't used to this, like it might be worth spending some time kind of speaking to people. There's a llama in the meeting. It might be worth speaking to people in advance, like if they know they're going to have an issue, like having a phone call with them, talking them through getting online, particularly for people that aren't really used to online spaces, and what they should expect when they need to download or get into the meeting, etc. I've spent so much of the last few weeks doing like tech support on the phone to people. And yeah, the next thing is around kind of participants and participation. So there's obviously, in online meetings, we have some real benefits in that people can join from all over the world. Like in this meeting, there's people from all over the place. And for some people, it's more accessible, but there's obviously like a lot of barriers to that. So as a facilitator, some of the kind of tools that you have to try and like enable participation is using the chat box, as Lee said. So if you've got a lot of people in a meeting, one of the issues is that it's really hard for people to judge when other people are going to speak in the way that you might do in like a face-to-face meeting. So the chat box is a really useful tool for putting in symbols. For, like Lee said, you can have an agreed symbol with your group that means I want to speak, I want to ask a question, I want to clarify, etc. You might, for some groups, you might want to simplify that, so it's just a question mark or just like anything in the chat. For some groups, it might be worth developing a bit of a culture of more complicated symbols that make it easier to facilitate a space, in the same way that in some groups you might use lots of hand signals in a face-to-face meeting, in some groups you might not. And then also as a facilitator, you can use the list of participants. So all these things are at the bottom of the screen. There's a little chat box with the like little speech bubble, and also a list of participants, and that will pop up at the side. And you can use that with like getting people to rename themselves in various ways, like putting pronouns or their organization in that. If you've got a lot of people, you can use the chat box for people to introduce themselves rather than doing a kind of go round. And as a host, you could also, you have got a lot of power as a Zoom host. So you can rename people, you can mute people, you can remove people if necessary. And obviously there's in the same way that power dynamics in any kind of facilitation role work, you might want to use that when necessary. But they're quite useful tools that you can use as a host, and we can talk through how to do them if people have questions about it. There's other things that you can use, like features on Zoom, so reactions and raising hands. So again at the bottom you'll have a little reactions I don't know, tab, that means you can put like clapping or thumbs up or whatever, which can be a way to kind of get a temperature check of a room. And you can also use things like raising hands, slowing down, etc. I have tended to not use those because it doesn't work on everyone's computer. Like if you're joining from desktop, some of these things aren't accessible. And it also is just like another thing to think about. I tend to direct everyone to the chat, especially if you've got lots of people, because the list of participants can get really long and the screens can go through multiple pages. And then the final thing on kind of like the tech tools is the different types of view. So hopefully you've found this already, but when you join, it'll probably go into speaker view, which means the main person who's speaking is the big screen and the rest are at the top. As a facilitator, it's probably quite useful to be in gallery view, which means you can see all of the faces, and you can kind of scroll through and make sure that people are, like, you can try gauge how people are feeling from the videos to some extent. And then, yeah, just some other tools. You can screen share, like Lisa's doing right now, so you can show things like this. And we were discussing whether it's better to screen share or to just send out the link to this presentation. In my experience, having multiple things that you want people to toggle through can be quite overwhelming for people. Like if they've got like a Google Doc with minutes and a slide, like a Google slide or another kind of presentation that they're looking at, and also there's the Zoom application with the chat box, like that can get really overwhelming for people. Yeah, so you can record the webinars like we're doing right now. You can use breakout rooms, so this is one way you can make spaces a little bit more participatory, so you can put people into smaller rooms. As the host, you can put people into smaller rooms for discussion. And the final thing is you can use polls, so you can set them up in advance of the meeting, and then you can survey people. So if you have something you need like everyone to vote on, or if you want to use them for a feedback thing at the end that says like, how did you find this? These can be really useful ways to get like input from people. Yeah, we put a little thing about here on participatory stuff in Zoom meetings. I've definitely found that there is a bit of a balance between participatory and like accessibility sometimes. Like, as I said, like a lot of the tools that have been used, like the naming slide we just did, require you to kind of go onto a different page, move things around, etc. And that can be quite difficult and overwhelming. So like with any facilitation, it's definitely about judging your group and judging what people are going to be, what's going to be useful and what's going to be like a step too far. And yeah, screen sharing can be a way to kind of make it a bit more visual without having to get people to do loads of different things. Do you want to move on, please? Yeah, no, back. The security one. Back one more. Yeah. So, okay, security is something that like lots of people are really concerned about. And I think as people who are hosting events, it's like really important to pay attention to this, partly because some of the things that have been happening in Zoom meetings can be quite upsetting. And it also, you know, the more people have experience of being unsafe in spaces, the less people are likely to engage with all the really amazing events that are happening right now. So yeah, someone putting in the chat they've experienced Zoom bombing. It can be really, really horrific. So it's something to take really seriously as a facilitator. So as I said before, only sharing the link as far as it needs to go, consider using a sign up, and then some like tech things. So you can add a waiting room and you can disable join before host when you set it up, and that's really useful. The waiting room is really useful because it means you can have a check-in with your co-facilitators before you let everyone in, and also you can kind of see the names that have come up. So if you're expecting certain people, you can see the names, although people sometimes share Zoom accounts, etc. So you might not want to not let people in because it's not the exact name that you're expecting. And join before host basically means that people can't use the link outside of the specific time that you set it up for. So that's quite useful in terms of just protecting the Zoom account that you might need to be used for lots of different events. Really, really important, like the most important thing is to prevent screen sharing from participants, so that someone who's come into the meeting can't share their screen and show any kind of like harmful content. And any co-host will be able to share. So if there's a few of you in the meeting, you can just make all those people co-hosts and they can share their screen, but other people won't be able to. Make sure that in the settings, so in the actual settings, not when you set up the meeting, but in the back end of the settings, you disable allowing removed participants to join, because if somebody is causing disruption, you can remove them quite easily, but if you haven't done this, then they can just get straight back in and they can just do it again. So that's like a really important thing to make sure is right. And also just having someone else on hand to help with tech issues is really, really useful. If you're presenting and you're sharing your screen or you're facilitating and asking questions, it's really hard to see the chat box, to see other people's faces, and to be doing like removing anyone if that's necessary. So like having someone who's just doing that is really helpful. And yeah, but I would recommend before you host a meeting, particularly a big meeting, like just get a few of you in a room together and practice removing participants, muting, turning off video, like all the things you might have to do if something did happen. And most of these you can do by either hovering over their video and 3 dots will come up. It won't for you because you're not hosted this meeting, but 3 dots will come up and you'll get options like turn off video, remove, put in waiting room, etc. So yeah, have a go at doing that before. And some of the things you can do is you can, if everyone's in the meeting that you want them to be, you can lock it so no one else can join. You can also disable participants being allowed to unmute themselves. So I've used this in big webinars. So like, you know, you've got 50 to 100 people or more in a Zoom call. If somebody is presenting something, it might be worth just turning off all the other microphones and like make it so they can't unmute, just so there's no background noise, there's no one accidentally does it. And you can also do things like disabling chat and disabling virtual backgrounds. And if you've updated to the most recent version of Zoom, if you're a host, you'll have a kind of security shield at the bottom of your screen if you're the host, and you can do things like turning off the chat, you can turn on, turn off the waiting room, that kind of thing. So you could do that like on and off in meetings if there's things that you isn't so useful at that time. And the reason for turning off virtual backgrounds, they can be really useful, but they can also, it's one way that people can put up images that you don't want to share, for instance. There's also, yeah, we put a link on here to Training for Change's guidance on avoiding disruption, which is pretty useful and goes into detail on a lot of these things. But I just wanted, does anyone have any other like comments or questions on this? We can take a couple now if that's useful, or like anything you want to add. If not, that's fine. Just put a little star in the chat box if you want to ask a question.
Thanks, Kate. It looks like it was really clear. No questions, or maybe everyone is just really, really shy. But thanks for this, and we'll can we share something related to this? Yes, of course, go for it.
Just like one thing to mention also about like the whole issue of security and kicking or removing people from sessions. So like I've had 2 experiences being Zoom bombed before. And one instance, because the person who came in copied the name of one of the people who was meant to be the co-host of the session. So I noticed you all mentioned earlier, like sometimes for roles about making someone a host, co-host, etc. So this person made that their name to be one of the persons who was supposed to be the co-host, and the host accidentally shared co-host privileges to the Zoom bomber. So from that point forward, it became chaos, and that person was locking people out, kicking people out. And what happened after that is the host, myself, I started trying to get rid of this Zoom bomber. So what this person started doing was, as I was trying to kick this person out, they were changing their names to someone else in the chat. So I would accidentally end up kicking out some people who are already in the chat. So this is something that maybe if you ever do face this, you might want to just put everyone back in the waiting room and send a message to everyone to state that please put your name and your organization or like where you're from. So at least you have some form of authentication, like, because if someone puts if there's two leases from Gastivists, then okay, I'm not letting both these leases in until like I can clarify who is who, because this has happened like quite a number of, like, the 2 times that this happened, it happened both times. Like once I was the host, another time someone else was. And like, just as something to note, that people who come in, they can be crafty too and very annoying, very, very annoying.
Yeah, totally. And I think like some people doing this are clearly just like playing around, and some people are doing it in a targeted way. And so yeah, it's worth to be really aware of that. I guess some things that I would recommend is trying to get all of the co-hosts in before, and like do all the co-host permissions, etc., like before the meeting starts, like when you know that there's only people who are meant to be there are there. Yeah, I guess it also depends on your group, because I know some groups, particularly where there's people in the call who really cannot, like, should not be exposed to some of the stuff that Zoom bombers have been doing. Like, I know some groups have kind of said, if this happens, we will end the meeting, just as a way to like protect people from like harmful content. So it might just be it's just worth having a plan, I think, with your co-hosts before, and figuring out how you're going to react to this, and what's the most useful thing to do for your group in that time. Yeah, someone's put in the chat as well, there might be an issue with Zoom themselves, how they collect personal information about who come to a meeting. Completely. We'll talk at the end a bit about some alternative platforms that can be used, that are more open source and different things like that. I guess, like, for me, using Zoom is quite useful because a lot of people are used to it now, and so it's every new platform people have to engage with is kind of be a barrier, and some of the facilities that it gives you, like closed captioning options, etc., are really useful in terms of accessibility. But again, yeah, it's like figuring out the best thing for your group.
Yeah, thanks. That's really useful. And I think those conversations already here like show that it's not necessarily that there's one way to go about it, but rather that there's different options, and it's about finding what fits your needs and the needs of your group best. But thanks for this, Kate, and everyone who's contributed. That was really useful. We'll have more time towards the end as well for any other questions if you want to come back on this or on anything else. But right now we're going to move to the next agenda point. So we're going to talk a bit more about kind of the role of the facilitator, a bit more broadly. So first we thought it would be nice to maybe not let you sit and listen to us talk for an hour and a half nonstop. So this is a chance for you to input a little bit. If you go on slide 6, then you can input. Basically what I'm asking you is, if you think about any kind of meeting you've been in, whether in person or online, what has worked and what hasn't worked, and what have you maybe noticed from the facilitators, or when you've been facilitating, that has worked really well or has made a meeting go really smoothly? Like any tools or any attitudes, any approaches that you felt, oh, this works really well or this doesn't, and maybe think a little bit about how some of these can potentially translate online. And I'm gonna give you maybe between 3 and 5 minutes to add anything that you might think of in those kind of 2 boxes of do's and don'ts in the slide directly, and then we can chat a bit about them and unpack some of them maybe. Yeah, so I'm going to give you about like 3-5 minutes now to add anything you want to add in there. Okay, I see we've had quite a lot of contributions, which is really good, and is gonna make the conversation go quite smoothly, and maybe make the next slide more or less useless, but that's fine. It's nice to see that there's a lot of knowledge and ideas in the room already. So I'm going to go through a little bit what's been added on there. Maybe I'll start with the don'ts, because I think that some people are still adding on the do's. So on the don'ts, we have a first point on abusing of the role of the facilitator to spread their own opinion or interrupt. So I think that Kate has already mentioned earlier in the presentation that as a facilitator, you have, whether it's online or in person, you have a lot of power. And it's, yeah, it can be very easily abused to spread opinions or interrupt. And I think building onto that, I think it's quite useful to, when thinking about a facilitator in a meeting, to think about maybe someone who isn't very involved in the discussion or in the meeting, or won't necessarily have a lot that they want to contribute. Not that a facilitator can't contribute in a meeting, but I think it's having kind of these two hats of, I'm a facilitator, but I'm also a participant, can make it really difficult to jump from one to the other, both for the facilitator and for the people in the room. So sometimes it's quite useful to have a facilitator that is not totally removed from the meeting or the topic or the conversation, but that isn't too involved in it, so that they can have this role of the facilitator without being so invested. There's a second point on don't notice that people raise their hands or put a star in the chat box. I think that happens a lot on Zoom, especially when you're facilitating a meeting. If there's loads of people, then things can become quite quickly a bit confusing or overwhelming. So I think it also comes back to what Kate was saying earlier, that it's really useful to pair up, or sometimes, like if your meeting is going to have over 30 people, sometimes it's even nice to have more than 2 people, so that someone can be just on facilitating the conversation, someone can be on taking stack of people raising their hands, so that you can kind of divvy up the roles and responsibilities and make sure that things don't slip too much, because it can become really overwhelming quite quickly if loads of people want to input at the same time. The next don't is around not being familiar with the features of the platform, and that can make the meeting longer or more difficult, which is a very fair point, especially for online meetings. And that's why hopefully now with Kate's presentation on Zoom and other people's inputs, that won't happen if you're facilitating a meeting on Zoom. But yeah, it's quite useful for a facilitator or a facilitating team to make sure that they're comfortable with the platform before hosting a meeting on it, and encouraging, as Kate said, encouraging people to try it and play around with it before the meeting actually happens, so that you can make sure you're comfortable with it before it starts. And the next one, the last one on don'ts, is about not providing support to the group or checking in with the group. So I'm guessing this is about, again, like the power of the facilitator. I'm not sure exactly what was meant by that. Maybe the person who put this one in, do you want to extend a little bit on what you wanted to cover with this? Because I think it can be like a few different things. So if anyone who was the one who put this on the list want to expand a little bit on what they meant by this.
Sorry, Lisa, do you mean the last one in the don'ts?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. I put that there. So basically, it was just a form of summarizing basically what a facilitator should not be, what we try not to do, basically. So it's not providing a support to the group, and not explaining everything, or not providing the time that people need to understand all of the instructions, or basically not making sure that everyone has the same amount of time of speaking, trying to make people that don't speak a lot like speak up, or people that are taking space into the meeting to like slow down or back down a bit. And what else did I do? Oh yeah, this is just a general summary, and see if actually the group is with you as a facilitator, so you don't lose the group. It's just, or yeah, in the end it's going to be just you talking by yourself, so you don't want that. This is what I was trying basically to say in a fewer words, because it's a lot of words that you're putting in. But it's okay. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Natasha. Yeah, I think it's a really good overview and summarizing of how facilitation can like become out of hands when we're not necessarily really clear on what is needed from a facilitator. But yeah, that was really useful. Thank you. I'm going to try to whiz through the do's a little bit. There's lots of stuff in there, and a lot of really important points. So the first one on the list is being able to handle, summarize here and there, and move presenters along when it's a long session. I feel like there's some painful experiences coming through there, which I think a lot of us can share, that sometimes both in person and online, it can be difficult not to do the timekeeping, basically, which is one of the main roles of the facilitator, to make sure that things move along and don't get derailed too much. It's definitely even more challenging online, in the sense that if you have, for example, a panel of speakers, and then one speaker is just getting like running over a lot, you have a bit less tools around you than in person, where you could be like kind of waving or sending some body language signals. Online, you're kind of left with trying to message them heavily on the chat box privately, being like, you're running over. But it can be a bit difficult. But yeah, that's one of the challenges of the facilitator, is making sure that time is being kept, but also to have the ability to summarize and kind of restate the information that's been shared in a shorter and more digestible way. So again, if you've had a really long and complex conversation for an hour where loads of people have provided a lot of input and information, the group can be left a bit like, okay, that was a lot. Where are we actually at? So that's when one of the roles of the facilitator comes in, of being able to say, okay, we've been discussed for an hour. These are the main points that have been made, and this is where we are, and this is now where we're going to get to, which I think is also just something that becomes easier with practice, but is a very important role to make sure that everyone can stay engaged and invested in the meeting.
I think it's like especially important online as well, because it can be much harder to concentrate. Like, I'm sure everyone's been in Zoom calls or online calls where you've accidentally just zoned out because something's happening in your house that's separate or whatever. So yeah, keeping people up to date with what's happened in the discussion is really essential.
Yeah, thank you, Kate. Definitely. Yeah, I think we're all finding it a bit difficult to stay focused on a screen in a Zoom call. Frida is asking a question on whether there's a Zoom tool to show participants as a host that they're running out of time, like a clock or something. There isn't, to my knowledge, but this is something that you can agree on with the different speakers if it's a panel or something like this beforehand. So you can say, for example, Kate, when you're at your 1 minute warning of the time slot that has been given to you, I'll put a little star in the chat box for you privately, or I'll raise my hand, or I'll like send the thumbs up signal, like whatever works for you. But it can be useful to agree that beforehand, so that you have a way to go about it without just frantically messaging them on the chat box if you haven't flagged before that they should keep an eye on the chat box for time. But thanks for asking this, Frida. Yeah, so Ameline is saying our group has started putting up a piece of paper saying 15 minutes gone, 30 minutes gone, things like this that the host puts up on the video. That can work as well, because maybe if the speakers are really kind of full into what they're saying, they might not look at the chat box, but they might see you if you start waving a piece of paper like this on your camera. So that can be useful as well. Like, again, whatever works for you and your group in this moment. The next one is to be responsive. Again, that's a very good point. It can be a bit like broad or vague to say be responsive, but the role of the facilitator is to be attentive and responsive to both the needs of all the participants in the room, but also to the energy in the group and where the group is at. So that can be, for example, if you're facilitating all day meetings in person or 2 hours meetings online, it's important to be responsive to where the energy is at and be like, I feel like we're reaching a point where people are not really engaging much. Can I get a bit of a temperature check on where the energy is at? Do we want to continue talking about this thing? Do we want a break? Do we want to move on? Trying to really respond to where the group is at. And you're not a psychic. You don't necessarily always get to guess this. And I think it's important to be able to be transparent in your facilitation as well. You're not born with those facilitation skills, and you can just ask the group a lot and ask the people who are in the meeting. It's not going to make you a bad facilitator to say, okay, I'm not sure, I feel like there's a bit of a low energy now, I'm not sure what's needed or what's happening, but let's have a check-in. Do we need a break? Do we need to move from this conversation? Do we want to actually resolve this point right now? Like, just let people come in as well, in the sense that facilitation is not just the job of the facilitator. It's more of a mindset that everyone gets in, and it's everyone's responsibility for a meeting to be well facilitated, not just the facilitator. So being responsive is important, and you can do it in a really transparent way. The next one, Kate, are you the one moving on the presentation?
No.
This is weird. Okay. So the next one is to have someone monitor the waiting room to constantly late comers in. That's really important for online meetings. People have other things to do in their day, and they have a lot of meetings. They're likely to be late. Happens to all of us. And if you don't keep an eye on the waiting room, you might just miss someone who was just 2 minutes late and won't get to participate in the meeting at all because you've just let them hang in the waiting room, which is not the most fun. Can happen, but it's nice to have someone keeping an eye on the waiting room. And again, like if you're worried about like not being able to to do this or this slipping away, you can also put other things into place, whether that's like an email address, or if you have another way of communicating, you can say, hey, if you have any problems joining, you can reach us at this email address or at this number, like whatever works for you, so that if people are having trouble with tech or with being left in the waiting room, they can have another way to get in touch with you so that they are not left behind. Next, we have gather the questions in the chat and ask them in good order. So I think that's about taking stack, especially when there's a lot of people, there might be a lot of questions, and then you're going to end up scrolling through the chat box to see who was first. It can be useful sometimes. Personally, I find it really useful if I'm facilitating online or in person, really, to have a piece of paper and just take stack there, so that I can stay present in the moment and what's happening, and not have to scroll through dozens of messages, and just have this list to come back to. But again, it's kind of whatever works for you, and depending on the nature of your meeting, you might want to take questions one at a time or group them. Sorry, Amelin, take stack. So taking stack, I think, is a bit jargony. I apologize. It means, for example, if we're opening questions or taking inputs, and there's like 3-4 people who want to come in and are going to put either, for example, little stars in the chat box or put their hands up if it's in person. The stack is kind of the order in which people are going to come in. So, for example, if Ameline, if you put a star in the chat box and then Frida does, and then Natasha does, then I will take the stack that, okay, Ameline first and then Frida and then Natasha. And that can become a bit more complex if you have the system of direct points, which we introduced as this little symbol earlier in the meeting, but in person can also be with 2 hands up, which usually is used when people want to make a direct point or response to what's being said, and that means they will jump the stack. So if Kate puts a direct point to this stack that I just used as an example now, she will speak before all of you because what she wants to say is directly related to what's being said. So taking a stack and managing the stack like this is really useful, but I think it's also useful quite often to make sure that this is not abused, and it's your role as your facilitator to also remind those things, that a direct point is not to be used for I really want to speak right now, but rather for this is related and needs to be said right now. I'm gonna try to move a bit more quickly because there's just been a lot of really useful things on this list, so it's taking a bit longer than expected, but it's also really useful. Create a safe and welcoming space. So that I think that's probably one of the most important roles of the facilitator, is to make sure that everyone in the room feels safe, but also empowered and able to participate. And there's a lot of power dynamics to take into account, and there's also a lot of tools that can be useful to make sure that you create a safe space for everyone. So there's going to be a lot of power dynamics in any kind of meeting and any kind of group, due to kind of the wider context and the different forms of systemic oppressions that people can be subject to, and that might impact how able or empowered they are to participate. So, for example, usually or generally, if you're a white middle class straight cis man, you might find it easier to participate and more comfortable, because this is kind of the context in which in which we're in as a society. And for people of color or differently abled people, for non-cis men, it might be a bit more difficult or uncomfortable to participate in a meeting. And it's one of the roles of the facilitator to make sure that those power dynamics are addressed, and that we provide as safe as possible space. So as Kate said, we will go through some tools, but things like ground rules, setting ground rules at the beginning of a meeting, and reminding the ground rules whenever is needed quite regularly. There's a lot of tools that can help, but this is one of the big roles of the facilitator, and also will differ depending on groups, because there's also some internal groups dynamics or interpersonal dynamics that will come into play as well. So it's important to be really aware of those things as a facilitator, and to try to address them and ensure that there's a safe and welcoming space, but also, again, to make this a collective responsibility, not just the responsibility of the facilitator. Okay, I'm gonna whiz through a bit more quickly. So adding a little interactive moments and being comfortable with pauses, I think those two things are like important and become easier with experience, but making sure that there's interactive moments so that people stay engaged and being comfortable with pauses, because they will happen. And it's a bit awkward at first, but actually sometimes it's just something that we need to gather our thoughts. Explain acronyms if speakers don't do it. Very important to make sure that your meeting is accessible and that people are engaged. Quite often the best thing is to avoid acronyms or jargon, but as we've seen just now with what I did, it's sometimes we forget, and it's fine, but making sure that you clarify them. And sometimes it's good to check each other as facilitators, and say, hey, you just used this acronym, people might not be comfortable with it, can we explain it? So that it doesn't put the responsibility on participants to do it. Clear explanations and guidelines on something that sentence hasn't been finished. I'll go to the next one. Preparation beforehand, alternating between big group and small groups, individual times. So there's breakout rooms on Zoom. Again, this is about keeping it interactive, keeping the energy up, because being in a big group, in a big plenary meeting with loads of people can be a bit tiring, and also some people will find it more comfortable to participate in smaller groups. So that can be useful to alternate between those different settings. Try to have as much possible times where people don't stay only in their head, which is the risk with online tools, but also involve creativity and emotions, head, heart, hands. That's a really good point. And it's where the creativity of different facilitators can come in. You can do energizers, you can do icebreakers, so that people are not just asked to sit and listen, or input in very brainy or technical conversations. Try to shake things up a little bit so that people keep engaged. And finally, have a co-facilitator who can keep an eye on the chat. Yeah, it makes it so much easier and also so much more fun to not facilitate alone, whether you're online or in person. Having a co-facilitator is really useful. It makes it easier to keep an eye on different things. It makes it more fun. And it can also be a really nice way to empower people. So for example, if you're an experienced facilitator in a group, you can suggest to others to come in with you to co-facilitate and prep together. And maybe someone who's never done it before will feel more comfortable doing this with you than actually facilitating a meeting on their own. And that's how you skill up, and that's how you learn new things. And it's really interesting and fun. that was a lot. Thank you. I'm going to quickly move to the next slide, but actually most of what we wanted to say has been covered by your input, which is really great. So we've kind of done it collectively, but quickly, facilitation is the act of assisting or making easier the progress or improvement of something. So it's really about like kind of supporting a group to get through conversations, rather than having the responsibility of making the decisions, or having all the input. It's about helping the group have an efficient and inclusive meeting. So we've covered that before. It's like making sure people are empowered and able to participate, and it can be useful to check in with people if you notice people who are not necessarily engaging a lot or participating a lot, or on the opposite, people who are taking a lot of space. It's nice as a facilitator to try and check in with that. Facilitation is a mindset everyone can bring, not just the job of one person. We've covered that as well. It's about a collective responsibility. It's not all on the facilitator. Facilitation is about supporting the group to move forward together, often taking the time to explore differences and disagreements is the most productive things to do. And then facilitation is about holding space, helping the group work together and make decisions. And it's about being multi-partial on everyone's side. So that's also what we covered of the facilitator, as much as possible, shouldn't be taking sides. And that's why sometimes it's easier to facilitate a meeting or a conversation if you're not invested yourself in the conversation. Which might be a good question to ask yourself before you come in to facilitate something. Do I have a lot that I want or I should input in this? If so, maybe I should think about, is there someone else who can facilitate, or how can I make sure that I can change hats during this conversation? Okay, that was quite a lot of me talking at you. I'm really sorry, but also that was from your contributions, which was really useful. And you actually covered most and more of what we wanted to cover in this section. So that was really useful. But before we move on to some facilitation tools, does anyone want to add anything on this? You can put a little star in the chat box if there's anything you want to add or any question. Kate.
Yeah, just a couple of things that I was thinking about when you're explaining these. I think the points around clarity are like one of the most important things for online meetings, because so it can be really new for people. It can be asking people to do use different skills, etc. And if you're asking people to do a kind of exercise, maybe leave double the time to explain that. And particularly around breakout rooms is something that I learned from a couple of sessions I did, is that if you're going to put people in breakout rooms, with say it's a meeting with 100 people that don't know each other necessarily, and you're going to split them into random groups, making it really clear to people early on that that's what's going to happen, and explaining to people how they get in, but also how they can get out of those rooms if they don't want to be there. Having a certain conversation with someone. Also important to know about breakout rooms, that the features not being able to share your screen, etc., don't work in breakout rooms. So they do get less safe to a large extent. So yeah, just to be aware of and explain to people how to navigate that.
Thanks, Kate. Anyone else? Okay, and also one last thing on this from me, also just ask for help. And if at some point as a facilitator you're confused or you're not sure what to do, just say so. It's it's fine. You're not expected to be a perfect facilitator straight away, and sometimes just being transparent is the most helpful thing and will just make you more human. I'm a big pro of, as a facilitator, sometimes being like, guys, my brain is frozen. If anyone wants to jump in on how to move forward from this, that would be really helpful. And again, this helps with the collective responsibility and not centering all the power in the facilitator. And it can feel a bit scary, but most of the time it's fine. So just try to have fun with it, and just to make it a bit more collective responsibility. Great. We're going to move on to some facilitation tools, which Kate will take us through.
Okay, there has been a lot of looking at presentation slides and going through various things. So I thought I'd start this bit with, and that's because of the time scale basically, but I thought we'd start this with a bit of a game or an energizer to like get people moving again. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give some instructions, and you in your homes can, wherever you are, can follow them if you want to. You also obviously don't have to. So the first thing is to, from where you're sat, or if you need to get up, to touch something blue. And then touch something pink. Shows I have rainbow flags behind me, makes it really easy to do this game. Touch something yellow. Touch something fluffy. And then type in the chat what your fluffy thing was. A cat? No. Nice, great. The end of a rope. Ooh, interesting. Cool. Yeah, that's an example of like a kind of silly, really quick, like game. I don't know if you can call it a game thing that you can do as like an energizer to get people, I know, thinking in a bit of a different way. There's lots of other ones. If we have time at the end, maybe people could share some. Some ones that I use sometimes is like giving people 2 minutes to find as many orange things in their room as possible, and then like seeing who has the most and having a winner in that way. Or you can do like trying to get the group to count to 10, for instance, without speaking over each other, so people can kind of say a number when they think no one else is going to say it, and see if you can get to 10 without having to start again. And yeah, we can maybe go through some more like little things like that that you can do to kind of break up an online meeting, which is mostly just staring at a screen. Yeah, exactly. Lee said that game is hard enough to do in a room of people. It is hard to do, especially with a lot of people. Cool. So yeah, energizers and games, in the way that we might use these in workshops and meetings face to face, they can still be done online, and actually could be more important in terms of getting people back engaging in like using their brain in a different way, like someone said before, using like using hearts and hands as well as heads within spaces. So there's a few more things on here. We've already talked about some of them, but I'll just run through them. So having aims and agenda. So this is kind of about clarity. If in online spaces, this is really useful to have a really clear agenda for the meeting. Maybe let people know if you're going to have access breaks and when they can expect them. And also like making that clear somewhere. So if you've got a kind of document that people are using that they can go back to, so they can look at the agenda, or if you want to put it in the chat and like repeatedly put it in the chat, and that can be really useful, so people kind of know what's happening for the duration of the session. A slideshow is what we're using now, so it's a way to make things visual. I tend to use them as a bit of like an online flip chart, which is what Lise was doing with the what makes a good facilitator. In the same way that you might write up something on a flip chart, you can put it on a slide to make it visual, to help people see that or summarize points. Go rounds, we did a slight version of that where everyone typed their name into the chat, into the circle that we had before, which is one way to do it. And putting people's names in the chat can be really useful if you've got a really big group. But if you've got a smaller group, it's also can be really nice to do a go round at the start, so people can speak early. If people have spoken early on in a session, they're more likely to participate later on. And it also gives people a chance to test their microphone, which is also really useful in online spaces. And obviously go-rounds can be used throughout a session to get everyone's thoughts on a particular issue, or if there's like an emotional topic that's come up, to give people a chance to speak, to make sure that everyone gets a chance to say something and not just the people who are comfortable speaking up. Because as Lee said, there are power dynamics, and a lot of these are exacerbated, like made more intense by being online, because you have to kind of unmute, speak into your computer. Like some people find that really difficult. I'm going to come back to that in a minute because we've got a slide that can explain it. Small groups, breakout rooms, we've talked about this. It's a really useful facilitation tool to get people speaking in smaller groups who might be more comfortable speaking up. You can also potentially cover more material if groups are working on it in smaller spaces. Pairs is on here. So pairs is, you can put people in pairs in breakout rooms. I would actually recommend against this if you're doing an online meeting, just because people's internet drops out all the time. And if you put people in pairs and their pairs internet drops out, then they just get left in a breakout room on their own. And it happens quite a lot, and it's quite hard to kind of monitor that. So maybe putting people in threes is useful, so that people don't end up just like stranded with a random, like with someone who's disappeared. Active listening and summarizing is what we talked about before. It's a really important facilitation tool always, but especially online. It's hard for people to feel heard in online meetings, I think. And listening actively to what people are saying and trying to summarize that for the rest of the group, especially if people in the group are distracted or doing other things, super important. Harvesting is kind of what Lise did before, where you get ideas from the group and then you put them all together. So you could do them as kind of, people could have typed them in the chat or put a star in the chat, and we could have taken people's ideas like that, or you can get people to kind of write down all their ideas in one space like we used just before. We talked about co-facilitation, how useful it is to have someone else, especially doing all the kind of tech things. Summarizing it here again, sorry. And drawing people out, I guess this is about participation. So if some people are being really quiet or not participating, how can you help those people engage? And one way to do that is how Lise did it, where people were typing in the document, and then you can ask those people to expand on a point that they made. Or if people are typing in the chat, you could ask them to expand on the point they made, to help people kind of participate in the meeting more. I think this can be really hard in online spaces, because if you're in a room of people and someone's being quiet but they're like making eye contact with you, you can kind of tell if they want to speak or if they are like actually just like, please don't make me say anything. And you lose that a little bit, especially if people have their videos off. You don't really know where they are, so it's obviously something to be kind of sensitive around. But getting people to engage in a small way, like posting in the chat, is a good way to like increase that engagement. Yeah, I just had a couple more things that I was writing down as we were going. not even tools, but just like random things I wanted to say. One of them is the chat box is obviously really useful. If it's worth knowing, if the meeting hasn't disabled saving the chat, then any private messages that you send will be available to anyone who saves the chat afterwards. So private messaging in the chat is a really useful tool to like check in with someone maybe, or to send a private message to your co-facilitator to say we're running out of time. But if you haven't disabled saving the chat, everyone will be able to see those messages. So don't have like personal or private conversations in there. You can also disable the private messaging function if you're worried about people in the meeting speaking to each other in a way that might not be safe. Like if you've got, we've had some sessions that we've run with minors, and we've disabled private messaging so that nobody could send them, ask for contact details, that kind of thing. And yeah, I just wanted to say a quick thing about accessibility as well. So like there are various things that are more difficult or easier in terms of accessibility online, and one thing I mentioned before is closed captioning. So you can have somebody typing up captions that come up so people can see what's being said if they can't hear it. We've also had sign language interpreters on some of our webinars, and then people who need that can just pin the video, and then that's really clear for them all that at the time as well. Yeah, if you want to move to the spectrum line. Yes, this is another tool. The template is from Training for Change as well. You might have used spectrum lines in face-to-face meetings where you get people to like stand on a spectrum between I really agree or I disagree or whatever your two angles are, and you ask a question and get people to position themselves along that, which can be a really good way of getting everyone's to voice and to show an opinion on that rather than voicing an opinion on it, and then you can ask for points from people along that line. And you can also do it online, so this is the same as what we did before, where you can add your name to the Google slide and then move it to a point on the spectrum line. So I could say like, do we think that there should be no more gas infrastructure built? And you could all put your, or it would be a statement, I don't think there should be more gas infrastructure built, and then you would put your name somewhere on that spectrum to show what you think about it. Yeah, and we can share that template as well. Move on. Okay, so last thing, I'm coming to the end. It's just some other tech tools. So we've talked a lot about Zoom because it's kind of what we're using and what a lot of groups are using, but people have obviously said there are loads of other platforms, particularly in terms of open source. Jitsi is one that I know a lot of groups have used, and it has some really good features. Like one feature I really like is it tells you how long everyone's been speaking for. So it's like an interesting way to like measure like who's speaking and why. And then in terms of like collaboration documents, like they're obviously really useful. And there's obviously Google Slides and Google Docs, which are used by a lot of groups, but there's also obviously like RiseUp and CryptoPad, which can be used if your group doesn't want to use certain software. And obviously there's a security conversation with all of this. Like if you're using Zoom or if you're using Google, none of that is secure. So you might want to consider some more secure alternatives like Wire or CryptoPad. If there's other ones that you want to recommend, feel free to drop them into the chat as well.
Great. Okay, in that case, if there's nothing more on this. We have about 3 minutes left. So we wanted to share a few useful resources that we found useful, like both in like putting this together and in like facilitating meetings and things like this. There's space on this slide. Feel free to add anything that you found useful as well. But just wanted to leave those, I know it's not much, I'm sorry, but leave those 3 minutes at the end if people have any questions or anything they want to add. Anything that hasn't been covered, feel free to put a star in the chat box and we can try and open those conversations before we wrap up. Okay, in that case, I mean, that works. That means we finish on time. So so thanks everyone for joining, and thank you so much, Kate, for being there to take us through it a lot. You will all get an email in the coming days where you'll have access to this presentation and the recording if there's anything you want to go back to, and you can also email us if there's anything that you would want to discuss further. The email will be included in the follow-up you will get from Eventbrite. But thank you so much for joining, and especially for participating so much. I think it's made it more, we built this more collectively than maybe we anticipated, which is really nice, and it's really great to get everyone's input. So thank you so much, and have a really great day, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Nice to meet you all.